Mom Jeans has been a very popular artist in the current era of midwestern emo and pop punk, and they have just released their third studio album, Sweet Tooth. Let's talk about it. It's been about 5 years since Mom Jeans put out an album, and as people do, people grow, people change, and you can feel that on the album. It feels very different than a lot of their previous work. They lean more into the more folky and sort of this like weird indie and pop punk fusion that's really popular, like kind of reminiscent of, I hate to say Group Love or some of the middle of the Front Bottoms discography, but that's a lot of the vibe that I get. The album opens up with Something Sweet, which is a catchy pop punk, just sort of very standard and earnest song. The lyrics just feel earnest. They're heartfelt. He's being emotionally vulnerable, and I think that that's a very common trend throughout this album. Also, these choruses are catchy as all get out. Some of the catchiest choruses I've heard in a while. The song also kind of introduces what I was hoping would be a little bit more of a motif of just mentioning sort of sweetness and cavities and sugar rush. They do mention it a few other times, but I was hoping for a few more mentions. They also make a lot of reference to quarantine and being inside and isolation, which really isn't too out of the realm of what most emo and pop punk artists would be doing. So I don't know that it's an intentional reference to quarantine, but they do mention just being inside and isolation quite a bit, and they sort of started in this song as well. The follow-up song, What's Up, it's a lot more sad and self-loathing, which again, that's what a lot of people are coming to Mom Jeans for. The production on this song, though, is like top-notch. I mean, there's so much going on. It feels very big and anthemy, which yet again, it's kind of another trend. You're going to see that in a lot of the songs. But these lyrics are exceptionally self-loathing. One of my favorite ones is, I think that I'm so self-aware, but I just overthink, but I still never realize how much I've been affecting. And yeah, it's almost like self-aware that it's being over the top and dramatic and just earnest and heartfelt. And like I said, that's what a lot of people come to Mom Jeans for, looking for that kind of sound. The follow-up track, though, on the other hand, Hippo in the Water, which is probably one of my favorite songs off the album, is nothing like anything that I've heard Mom Jeans specifically do. It feels very folky. I don't know how else to describe it. It's still upbeat. It still has electric guitar and these driving beats and this really catchy sort of chant to it, you know. But it doesn't sound like something that Mom Jeans has done before, and I think that this song kind of is the most that they lean into the sort of indie pop punk. I can't put my finger on what exactly that sound is, but they lean into it very hard on this song, and I think it's great. It's one of my personal favorites. I also really like that there's not a consistent song structure in this song throughout the album, and I'll talk about this a little bit later on. Is there's like a very predictable and sort of repetitive sort of just way that they build their songs. You know, they have these sort of softer intros, and they go into like catchy sort of verses that are kind of light and bouncy. Then they go back into the softer part, and then they go into this really big and massive bridge that leads you into the chorus, and it just feels like this very anthemic vibe. I think that a lot of the choruses, which I think is where this album really shines, sort of share that very anthemic and loud and energetic, and I think that this album in a lot of ways feels like what a basement show feels like. Like if you know, a TV show were going to be having a scene and there was a basement show going on, chances are that a song similar to any of the songs off this album would be the soundtrack for that part. And this sort of bigness, this sort of catchy bigness continues on in White Trash Millionaire, which is a really funny title. I applaud them for a lot of the titles on this release. It's got some interesting titles, but White Trash Millionaire sort of continues that largeness that they have in all these choruses. It does feel a lot like the front bottom song, especially off of Back on Top, and maybe some of the releases after that. It has a very similar vibe to that. It's hard, like I said, to put your finger on exactly what it is that sounds familiar about it, but it sounds familiar. The thing I think that makes a lot of what Mom Jeans stand out, especially in this release, is Eric's way of writing melodies and vocal delivery. A lot of his lines sort of slur into each other in a sense, like where you would expect the measure to end, he sort of starts the next train of thought, and it makes it feel like sort of a jumbled mess, but like a jumbled mess in the kind of way that you would imagine, something you wrote down in your notes app whenever you were really depressed to sound. You can really hear that throughout the album. I think it's sort of a staple of how Eric writes, and also just the way that he delivers melody. He has a tendency to sort of like go to a lower note that doesn't feel typical or standard and is very just Mom Jeans, and he does that quite a bit throughout this album, and I think that really kind of does a really good job of setting it apart and making it sound unique from a lot of other bands that are doing stuff that's kind of similar. Circus Clown starts up, and it has sort of an electric drum sound which I wasn't really super expecting. I'm not sure that they've done that before, but then once the song kicks in, I almost feel like I'm listening to Neck Deep, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it's not necessarily what I was expecting. I did like Circus Clown, but not my favorite. It does kind of kick off the theme, which is very normal of a pop punk album, but it sort of kicks off the theme of growing up and leaving town and coming back and things being different, and sort of just the struggle of being in the transitional state that is your mid-20s. Sugar Rush opens up, and it sounds like something off of a Real Friends album. Again, no complaints. I like Real Friends, but it sounds like something off of a Real Friends album. The production, again, is super solid, and this is another one of those songs that has this very sort of anthemic and big kind of ending, which is really the MO for this album. I think that if you had to describe the album in one sentence, it would be pop punk with trumpets and anthemic endings to songs. And this song is a very, very perfect example of that. Graduating Life definitely starts to be the more chill end of the album, and I hate to say more introspective, because it's Mom Jeans and the lyrics aren't exceptionally deep, so introspection is maybe a stretch, but it is the most introspective part of the album. It also has like a country vibe to it. Like, it almost sounds like there's some slide guitar in there, and just the guitar tones that they use in general feel a little bit like a country song, but it works really well in that sort of context. And the lyrics are very corny, but they work for what it is. I think that is something that people come to Mom Jeans for. It's just very straightforward and earnest lyrics, and this is a good example of that. Not my favorite, but I do like that they did decide to do a song that had a little bit of a different structure from the rest of the album, and I think it does a really good job of setting it apart, and it really does well leading into Love Later. I think this kind of marks the middle of the album's sadness. He talks a lot about the struggle of growing up, which is something that they sort of touched on in previous songs. Love Later sort of marks the end of the middle of the album. The song sort of carries on with the tone that Graduating Life does, and then it picks up a lot. The song is really just about the struggles of growing up, which is very standard, like I said, for pop punk music. They do have a line about self-awareness, which I do quite like. It goes, and I'm still just as angry, but now I've got no outlets. You only understand me if it's in a catchy chorus. And I think that really describes this album as a whole. You know, the catchy choruses are sort of what the album is here for, here to deliver and here to build around. And I think it's an interesting little bit of self-awareness that they showed, and I like that little touch. It genuinely, that little section makes me like the album a lot more, because it feels like they know. I do really like the talky bit. I love talky bits in music. I'm just a sucker for them, probably from years of listening to Listener and La Dispute and Touche Amore. Sort of tainted my opinion on talky bits, but I do really like the talky bit. And the chorus in this thing slaps so hard, which is so funny because he's literally like, oh, you only can understand what I'm talking about in a catchy chorus. And then they put the most like catchy and like when I tell you that chorus slaps, it's really good. It's one of my favorite parts of the album is the chorus on Love Later. The song also sort of talks about being okay with yourself and realizing that you're not always the problem in a relationship. And that's an important thing to remember whenever we go into Crybaby on the phone, because it feels like he just sort of backsteps from the progress that he would have made in Love Later. So I feel like Crybaby is maybe a little bit of a weird follow-up. Now, in terms of emotional flow of the album, I think that it does make a lot of sense to come after. But lyrically, it just feels a little weird. In fact, the rest of the album feels a little bit like retractive from Love Later, because the rest of the album is very self-loathing and very like, I'm the problem. What did I do wrong? Why can't you love me? Why don't you love me? And, it almost feels like in Love Later, he's like, it's okay. I'm going to be fine. So thematically, I think it's a little bit of a weird follow-up. Crybaby on the Phone does hit a really high emotional peak, though. I think it has one of the grandest and sort of biggest moments, which works really well, especially as a middle piece to the album. It's one of my favorites, actually, just for that bigness at the end. And I think, again, that's a theme with this whole album, is that there's a lot of bigness and themicness to it. Anime theme song, right off the bat, I feel like I'm listening to Motion City soundtrack, but it's good. It sounds good. I like that. I love Motion City soundtrack, so maybe I'm biased, but it was a really cool intro, and the pacing really does feel like an anime theme song. Going from the synthy guitar parts right into like a half chorus into like the slowed down acoustic part. I can envision a Naruto intro in my head, like the characters spinning around and doing anime bullshit. It's a funny name, but I think that it fits considering what the song is. Tie-Dye Acid Trip is just a vibey guitar track right off the bat. Like, it has a very catchy chorus, just like the rest of the album. I feel like this one is one of the most catchy. It's maybe not the biggest and largest of all the choruses, but it's definitely one of the most catchy. Very, very cute lyrics, like just... It gives me, it really just gives me like, send this song to your e-girl GF, you know what I mean? Like, that's just sort of the vibe that I get from this song. Like, the number of girls that probably received this song from their boyfriends, or will receive this song from their boyfriends in the next few months, will be honestly comical. There is something about Tie-Dye Acid Trip that reminds me of like the late 90s, sort of like alternative pop music that you would hear, sort of like a Kiss Me or like a Wonderwall. There's like a similar sort of vibe to it, and that kind of actually continues through the last couple of tracks, just having this sort of randomly like weirdly 90s nostalgic vibe out of nowhere. I mean, it's really nice. I'm 28, so I'm all here for a little 90s nostalgia, but it just it hit me very strangely whenever I first listened to that track. It was almost like I could imagine being in the car on the ride to school listening to it on the local rock radio station, which is not a bad thing, but it was just I'm not gonna say it was whiplash. It was probably just me connecting dots that don't exist, but that's just my take, and that's what you're here for. 10 minutes, it just feels like a teenage breakup song. It's a teenage breakup song. I can see it being played for, the part where the guy's sitting in his car and he just broke up with his girlfriend and everything's going to shit, and he's listening to this song, or it's playing in the background while he like cries and, breaks shit. That's just what it makes me think of. It just feels very like movie CW soundtrack. It is just a standard teenage breakup song. I don't know what else to say about it. Teeth is the closing track, which I actually really quite like. It does a really good job of making lyrical callbacks to earlier parts in the album, mentioning cavities and so on and so forth. There's definitely like a lot of like country vibes in this song, especially. or sort of like bluesiness. It's got like a swing. It's got like a swing in the verses, and it feels really good. The song makes me think of like I can just imagine myself at like 23 being drunk in a bar or at some random person's house and screaming the song at the top of my lungs. Like, it's not that there's a lot of emotional heaviness in the song, but just sort of the way the song is presented and the vibe just feels like a drunk, sad anthem. And I think that makes for an excellent closer. I will say that my only real complaint with the song is that every other song, they end the song with this really big bridge, this really big chorus, and they don't do that on this song. They just kind of stop without ever doing that. I guess they sort of break expectation, which there's nothing wrong with breaking expectation. But whenever you have like 9 other songs that end in a really big catchy chorus and you sort of set up a really potentially very catchy big chorus and then you just kind of end the song, it did feel a little underwhelming. Maybe that was intentional. Again, maybe I'm reading into it too much, but yeah, as a closer it works, but I was still just kind of hoping for one last big moment. Overall, I think that Sweet Tooth is a really enjoyable album. Mom Jeans is not reinventing the wheel here. They are doing what you've heard done by many other bands before, but they're doing it really well. Like the sort of the saying, they brought the steak and potatoes, but they did those steak and potatoes excellently. I enjoyed it. It does feel like they sort of dropped a lot of the twinkly guitarness and a lot of the more standard, I guess you'd say, like midwestern emo kind of vibe, and adopted more of a indie and folk vibe, which is not bad at all. I do think that it suits them, but it wasn't what I was necessarily expecting, especially coming off of their last 2 albums, and not necessarily a bad thing in the slightest. Just not necessarily what I was expecting, but I do think it was sort of a good change. They definitely took a lot of influence from, I hate to say Group Love, but my brain just keeps going to Group Love for some reason. There's something about it that reminds me a lot of Group Love and the front bottoms. That sort of indie, like I said before, that sort of indie rock meets pop punk kind of vibe. Sort of like a less introspective, less serious version of the Wonder Years. But they know what people want, and they deliver. They know that we want to hear catchy choruses. They know that we want to hear, very earnest and heartfelt lyricism, and they deliver that. And for that, I have no complaints. The production is super, super solid. There's a lot going on in some of these songs. There's background vocals and 2 or 3 guitars and synthesizers and trumpets, and everything just kind of fits very nicely. Whoever did the mixing and the production, top notch, honestly. They could have gone very poorly, but you can hear all the parts. Everything sounds very distinctive and crisp, while still having sort of the messiness that comes with being a punk band at heart. Overall, I would give it a 7 out of 10 for me personally, and if you are a teenager or in your mid-20s and really going through it, you'd probably give it an 8 or a 9. So, for me, a 7. But overall, a very enjoyable album. Thank you so much for watching. Did you listen to the album? Tell me what you thought. Do you think I'm right? Do you think I'm wrong? Let me know. Let's talk about it. And yeah, you can find all my social medias in the link description. And yeah, that's pretty much it. All right, later.